The year was 1965. The place was the Wickford Dam facility in rural Pennsylvania, a sturdy, aging concrete wall that held back a massive reservoir high above the valley floor. The town of Greenwood lay directly downstream, trusting in the permanence of that wall. Robert Hale was the civil engineer on site, a quiet, methodical man whose duty was to ensure that permanence. His life was governed by the integrity of the concrete. Every morning began the same way, a slow, meticulous patrol of the massive wall, looking for any deviation from the norm. He didn't trust quick glances. He trusted what decades of practice had trained his eye to see. He was making his rounds near the main overflow spillway, the channel built to manage high water. Everything looked right, coated in the usual damp moss and mineral buildup, but as he prepared to move on, something stopped him. It wasn't loud or obvious. It was subtle, a single line of darkness, almost invisible, running straight down the wall just above the water line. He knelt down immediately, ignoring the dampness. He pulled out his small, powerful magnifying glass and held it close. It wasn't a surface stain. It was a crack, a hairline fracture narrower than a strand of thread, but perfectly straight and deeply unsettling. It ran about 6 inches long, positioned at a spot where the wall took the very worst of the structural strain. It was the kind of weakness that would pass every automated sensor test. It did not yet weep water. It was just a warning, a single whisper of trouble in a wall of silent concrete. Hale felt a cold, immediate certainty in his gut. This wasn't simple surface wear. This was a sign of the immense, deep pressure that the reservoir was exerting. This crack meant the core of the dam was compromised. He knew that the entire weight of the water, acres wide and hundreds of feet deep, was now concentrating its force on this tiny, fragile weakness. He documented the flaw with excruciating care, recording the length, the width, barely a fraction of a millimeter, and its exact position. He felt the cold sense of dread growing. He knew with absolute professional conviction that this single line was the most dangerous thing on the entire dam. When he finished his inspection, he hurried back to the control room. He checked the dials, the gauges that measured the pressure inside the wall, the instruments that screamed danger were still quiet. The readings were within the normal range, yet Hale noticed a subtle, almost imperceptible rising of the needle associated with the spillway sector. The instruments were beginning to catch up to what his eye had already diagnosed. They were whispering the same warning. He sat down to write his report. He framed the language carefully, professionally, using every word to convey the urgency he felt. He wrote that the crack was a tension fracture, a sign of deep structural damage, and that it required an immediate specialized inspection team from the regional office. His duty was to the structure, but more profoundly, it was to the thousands of people asleep in the valley. He took the finished report to Mr. Jenkins, the facility operations manager. Jenkins was a man who lived by routine and, crucially, by budget reports. Jenkins was sitting at his desk, surrounded by schedules and expense logs. He didn't look up immediately. "Another concern, Hale?" Jenkins asked, his voice already conveying a sigh of familiar annoyance. Hale placed the report on the desk. "Sir, I have located a hairline tension crack near the spillway. The location is deeply concerning. I believe it indicates a failing shear point in the main structure." Jenkins finally looked up, his expression one of immediate skepticism. "A hairline crack? Robert, this dam is 40 years old. Concrete settles. We have thermal stress every spring and fall. We don't call the regional office and incur thousands of dollars in inspection fees for surface stress. We seal those in the scheduled maintenance next spring." "Sir, this is different," Hale insisted, leaning forward slightly. "This is not shrinkage. This crack is too clean, and the location, it's where the maximum strain is concentrated. The readings show a slight, persistent increase in pressure in that quadrant. It's a precursor, Mr. Jenkins. This wall is showing signs of tearing apart from the inside." Jenkins picked up the report and circled the expense figure for the inspection team with a red pen. He viewed the potential crisis entirely through the lens of cost. "The official pressure readings are still well within the green zone, Hale. We operate by procedure. Procedure says we only elevate this to emergency status when the pressure gauge passes the yellow safety line. Until then, you monitor it during your regular rounds. But, sir, with all respect, waiting until it passes the safety line is waiting until the failure is already imminent, Hale argued, trying to keep the desperation out of his voice. He felt a profound ethical pressure. He knew his job required deference to his supervisor, but his conscience demanded that he protect lives. Jenkins pushed the report back to him. He was firm and final. We are not disrupting the entire regional schedule and incurring massive unnecessary costs because of your feeling, Hale. You monitor the crack. You are explicitly forbidden from contacting the regional safety office or filing an emergency request until there is a measurable, substantial spike in the main gauges. Is that clear? Hale stared at the signed report. The dismissal was complete. Jenkins had reduced a threat to human life to a line item in a quarterly budget. Hale slowly took the report back. He knew that following that order, following the protocol, meant putting the lives of the entire valley at risk. He left the office, the moral dilemma already settled in his mind. He was the only person who knew the truth of the danger. He could not and would not go home and simply wait for the numbers to scream. His duty to his neighbors, to the sleeping town of Greenwood, superseded his duty to Mr. Jenkins and the budget. He had reported the risk. Now, his responsibility was to manage it alone. He headed back to the control room and pulled out the old, folded blueprints of the dam's core structure. He began working, not for his supervisor, but for his conscience. The afternoon brought the first sign that the environment was conspiring against the dam. The sky turned a heavy, bruised gray. The local radio reports began warning of an intense, prolonged rain event moving into the region, promising hours of heavy downpour. Hale looked out the thick control room window. The rain was not just an inconvenience, it was the catalyst for disaster. Every inch the reservoir rose added thousands of tons of pressure to that single flawed section of concrete. The water would penetrate the tiny crack, turning the tension fracture into a weapon of erosion, tearing the wall apart from the inside. The countdown to failure had begun. When 5 o'clock arrived, Mr. Jenkins departed, giving Hale a cursory wave and reminding him to lock up when he left. Hale didn't move. He watched Jenkins' car disappear down the winding access road. He then retrieved his personal duffel bag, a habit from his days doing remote field work, which held a small flashlight, a rain slicker, and a packet of dry crackers. He had already made the silent choice. He would not leave. He found the night maintenance worker and mumbled something about complex calibration data that required his oversight. He didn't lie outright, but he hid his true purpose. He felt the profound isolation of his decision. He was acting against authority, on instinct based on data that no one else was willing to validate. The rain started slowly, then rapidly escalated into a furious deluge. The sound on the concrete roof was deafening, relentless. The storm wrapped the entire facility in a thick, wet darkness. Hale monitored the instruments. The needle on the pressure gauge, which had been creeping up slowly all day, was now advancing with visible purpose. The combined force of the rising reservoir and the driving rain was translating directly into unbearable stress on the wall. He pulled on his heavy yellow slicker. He grabbed his high-powered flashlight and his crack measuring gauge, a finely calibrated tool he used for geological surveys. He left the security of the control room and walked out onto the dam wall, battling the wind and the sheets of falling water. The path was slick, treacherous. He felt vulnerable and small against the scale of the storm and the massive body of water roaring behind the wall. He reached the spillway. He shielded the exact location of the fracture with his body, shining the powerful beam directly onto the concrete. He saw the definitive change instantly. The hairline crack he had measured that morning had widened, visibly and substantially. More alarming, the crack was now dark and wet, actively weeping a slow, steady stream of water that ran down the face of the concrete. The water was no longer contained. It was forced through the structural flaw by the sheer power of the reservoir. The sight gave him a cold jolt of dread, confirming the absolute truth. The wall was yielding. The internal failure had accelerated. He took a photo with his small field camera, evidence that might save the town or ruin him completely. Hale retreated to the control room, shivering but energized by certainty. He was now operating in full crisis mode, managing a patient, the dam, that was rapidly failing. He was drenched, but the focus on the immediate measurable danger kept the exhaustion at bay. He spent the next 2 hours performing an exhaustive, unauthorized log of manual pressure readings near the spillway observation well. He didn't trust the main gauges alone anymore. He recorded the pressure every 15 minutes, plotting the data points on a large sheet of graph paper. The numbers were terrifying. The pressure was spiking disproportionately to the rise in the reservoir level. This confirmed that the stress was not being distributed normally. It was focusing all its immense power onto the single weakened spot. The wall was being pushed apart. He sat down and performed his final necessary calculation, working swiftly by the light of a small desk lamp powered by a battery pack. He factored in the current rate of the pressure increase, the speed at which the crack was expanding, and the total remaining strength of the structure. The result was a cold, hard number. If the relentless downpour continued at this rate, the dam would reach its critical breaking point and fail completely within 6 to 8 hours. Catastrophic failure. The massive body of water held back by the dam would be unleashed in one violent, destructive wave into the sleeping valley below. Hale thought of the thousands of dark, silent houses in Greenwood. He imagined the sudden, horrifying roar of the water and the sheer impossibility of escape. He had to assume that every one of those people was relying on the strength of his conscience. He moved to the telephone. He tried Mr. Jenkins's home line again. Dead silence. The intensity of the storm had cut all regional communication lines. He tried the police. He tried the regional power utility. All lines were unresponsive, either down completely or jammed with calls related to the storm. He was entirely, absolutely alone. The dam was failing, and no one outside the control room knew it. The power of decision had been thrust upon him by circumstance and the failure of all external systems. He looked at the main control panel, the lights blinking a silent warning. He looked at the massive red emergency floodgate override wheel. He knew what he had to do: manually open the floodgates. This would immediately lower the reservoir level, transferring the critical pressure off the failing wall. It was the only way to save the dam, but the violation of protocol was immense. Opening the floodgates meant intentionally flooding the emergency spillway channel, causing massive controlled damage to the channel itself and minor controlled flooding downstream. It was an act of insubordination that, if wrong, would cost him his job, his professional license, and his entire reputation. He would be ruined. He stood there, the engineer of the dam, holding the power to save lives in one hand and his entire future in the other. He approached the ancient heavy emergency radio transceiver. It was a short-range unit meant for specific communication with the regional safety office in Harrisburg. The air was thick with the hiss and crackle of atmospheric static. He put on the headset, he keyed the microphone, his voice cutting through the noise. He spoke with the utmost professionalism, stating his name, his rank, the facility, and the definitive crisis. Wickford Dam Facility reporting imminent catastrophic structural failure of the main spillway wall. Repeat, failure is imminent. Requesting immediate verified authorization to manually open the emergency floodgates for controlled pressure relief. He repeated the crucial, terrifying data: the visible crack expansion, the accelerating pressure curve, the 4-hour countdown to total breach. He repeated the message 3 times, slowly, trying to project the sheer urgency of the facts. He listened to the static. Only a faint, distorted voice responded, muffled by static and wind, asking for immediate repetition. He yelled the most critical, condensed facts into the microphone. Crack widening, pressure in the red, valley in danger. Do you read? Authorization needed. The voice cut out again. The radio went silent, defeated by the storm. He knew his final official attempt had failed. Harrisburg had received nothing but a fragmented, likely disregarded distress signal. No order would be issued. No validation would come. Hale slowly took off the headset. He was now truly alone. He was the only authority left. He walked back to the main gauge. The needle was now firmly, undeniably deep in the red warning zone. The silent alarm was flashing intensely. He felt the fear, the immense cold weight of responsibility. If he was wrong, if the wall had held and he had caused unnecessary flooding, the legal and professional consequences would crush him. But if he was right and he delayed 1 more hour waiting for an order that would never come, the valley would be destroyed. He thought about the people of Greenwood, the quiet families, the farmers, the small shop owners, They were all sleeping, their safety entrusted to this wall and to him. He could not leave them to the mercy of a failing structure and a dead telephone line. His moral struggle ended. The decision was no longer based on fear of consequence, but on the simple, absolute necessity of the action. His entire professional life had prepared him to read this data, and the data was screaming. Hale turned to the manual floodgate override wheel. It was a colossal cast iron wheel, designed to be operated only when all electrical power was lost. It stood taller than him, cold and solid. The plaque on the wheel, listing the severe conditions for its use, seemed to mock him. He took a deep breath. He had calculated he needed dozens of complete, strenuous rotations to lift the heavy steel gate, enough to effectively relieve the pressure. He put his hands on the cold spokes. He pulled with all his strength, using his full body weight, attempting to break the initial seal. The wheel was heavy, locked by years of disuse, and the immense pressure of the water on the other side. His back screamed in protest. His boots slipped on the wet concrete floor. The wheel did not move. He repositioned himself, focusing his entire body mass on the next pull. He pushed again, a sound of strained effort escaping his throat. With a tremendous metallic groan, the wheel finally yielded. The sound of scraping steel filled the control room. Hale began the long, agonizing process of turning. Spoke by spoke, rotation by rotation, he fought the massive inertia of the gate. He did not pause. He did not rest. He knew the clock was ticking towards 7 a.m. His hands became raw and blistered almost immediately against the rough metal, but he ignored the physical pain. He focused only on the action, the necessary, life-saving rotation. After what felt like an eternity, a full 15 minutes of relentless, punishing effort, he heard it. A faint, distant rumbling sound began outside the control room. It was the sound of the heavy steel gate finally cracking the seal. The rumbling grew quickly into a massive, powerful roar. The emergency floodgates were open. The reservoir, obeying the forces of gravity, began to release its immense volume of water in a furious, controlled torrent down the emergency channel. The sound was deafening, primal, and terrifying, but it was directed safely down the spillway. Away from the core structure, it was the sound of life being saved. Hale continued turning the wheel until the hydrostatic pressure gauge needle, which had been so stubbornly locked in the red zone, finally began its slow, visible descent. The relief was immediate. The massive pressure was draining off the failing wall. He watched the needle fall past the warning zone, stabilizing firmly in the yellow safety area. The emergency release had worked perfectly. He stopped turning. His body was shaking violently from exhaustion and adrenaline. The powerful roar of the released water continued, a constant reminder of the decision he had made. He looked at his watch. It was 4:45 a.m. He had bought the dam and the valley critical time. He leaned against the control panel, his forehead resting on the cool glass. He had done what was necessary. The sounds of the released water were the only consistent. Noise as the sky began to transition from the black of night to the bruised gray of dawn. Hale was exhausted, but he couldn't leave. He waited for the daylight, the evidence. As the sun began to rise over the rolling Pennsylvania hills, casting a pale, cold light on the facility, Hale walked out for his final inspection. The dam wall was exposed, the water level significantly lower. He found the side of the crack. It was still there, visible and dark, but the weeping had stopped. The fracture line was completely dry. The structural failure had been arrested. The dam was holding. He stood on the wall, watching the first light creep across the empty valley below. He thought about the people waking up in Greenwood, preparing coffee, unaware that a massive wall of water had almost destroyed their homes just hours before. The enormity of his choice, a choice made alone in the dark against every rule, settled over him. Then the phone rang. It was shrill, demanding, and insistent. The communication lines were finally restored. It was Mr. Jenkins, awake and furious, demanding an immediate explanation for the immense, unauthorized water release. Jenkins shouted about protocol, about the cost of the controlled flooding, and about the violation of every rule in the book. Hale spoke calmly, his voice rough with fatigue. He laid out the factual evidence. Sir, at 4:30 a.m., the pressure gauge passed into the critical red zone. The dam was failing. All communication lines were down. I initiated the controlled relief to prevent a catastrophic breach. Jenkins threatened immediate dismissal, formal investigation, and legal action. Hale simply accepted the threat. Sir, I understand the protocol violation, but the dam is intact and the valley is safe. Within the day, the Regional Safety Office dispatched an emergency team to the facility. They were angry, professional, and skeptical. They brought their specialized ultrasonic testing gear, the very equipment Jenkins had refused to pay for. They spent hours scanning the wall around the spillway. The results came in quickly. The lead structural engineer, a man named Henderson, called Hale into the control room. Henderson's face was grim but respectful. He confirmed Hale's findings. The tension fracture was far deeper than anyone on site had believed, extending nearly 70% through the concrete mass. He looked at Hale's handwritten pressure logs and the time he opened the gates. "Engineer Hale," Henderson said, his voice quiet, "your timing was precise. Our analysis indicates that the wall would have reached its tensile limit and breached between 7 Marawayam and 7:30 a.m. this morning. Your unauthorized action saved this entire structure, and more importantly, it saved the lives of everyone in Greenwood Valley." The investigation was swift. Hale was reprimanded for the protocol violation, but the evidence of his courage and his correct judgment was undeniable. He was reinstated, his professional integrity secured not by the rule book he broke, but by the disaster he prevented. Robert Hale stood by the dam late that afternoon. The reservoir was slowly refilling. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the valley that was now secured and quiet. He thought about the risk, the fear, and the intense isolation of that night. He had acted against every order, relying solely on his own professional instinct and moral duty. He looked at the vast, silent town below. He knew his job was safe, but that was secondary. He had done the one thing that mattered. He realized then the quiet, profound truth of his calling. Doing what's right isn't about being certain of the outcome. It's about having the conviction to act on the truth you know inside and refusing to ignore the warning you feel in your soul. He had heard the whisper of the failing concrete, and he had chosen to listen. And that, he knew, was the only true measure of an engineer.